If you were sitting quietly in your living room this morning, sipping your coffee, you might never imagine that in a small, windowless committee room here in Washington, D.C., decisions were being discussed that could determine whether thousands of Nigerian children ever feel safe in their classrooms again. Yet that was the reality on Thursday right inside this very room, where members of the U.S. Congress gathered to confront a question that has haunted Nigeria for decades. Why are innocent people still being killed, and what must the world do about it? Now I'm standing here today because something extraordinary happened. President Donald Trump's unexpected decision to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern has forced America, its lawmakers, its diplomats, its churches, and its ordinary citizens to look directly at the killings that too many leaders have tried to downplay. And inside this room, the conversations were not theoretical, not diplomatic, and not coated in the usual political sugar. They were raw. They were emotional. They were filled with stories of mothers burying children, pastors running from gunmen, and Muslim and Christian families alike wondering if their faith might cost them their lives. But here is the deeper question for all of us watching from the United States. Is this designation a punishment for Nigeria? Or is it the first real chance in years to save lives before the situation becomes irreversible? For millions of older Americans who still believe in moral responsibility in protecting the innocent and in the sacred partnership between nations, this conversation is not just about foreign policy, it's about conscience. It's about what we as a country do when violence goes unchecked and entire communities live in fear. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you will hear what American lawmakers truly think about Nigeria's killings, why this moment could change everything, and what it will take for both nations to finally confront a crisis that has been ignored for far too long. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, and that innocent lives, whether in Nigeria or here at home, deserve protection, please stay until the end and share this message with others. As Thursday's congressional hearing opened, the atmosphere inside the room carried a weight that could be felt even before the first witness spoke. This was not another routine policy discussion, it was a reckoning. For months, reports had been pouring into Washington, stories of villages, burned families, displaced churches, and mosques attacked, and entire communities forced to live under the shadow of terror. And then came President Donald Trump's unexpected decision naming Nigeria a country of particular concern for severe violations of religious freedom. That single decision jolted the American political system and forced lawmakers to ask a simple but painful question. What is really happening in Nigeria, and why has it gone on for so long? Inside the hearing, the Subcommittee on Africa of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee heard testimonies from Nigerians and Americans who have watched this crisis unfold for decades. And almost immediately it became clear that this wasn't a conversation about statistics, it was about human lives. Members of Congress, including Chairman Chris Smith, spoke openly about their recent meetings with Nigeria's delegation meetings that took place just hours before the hearing began. Led by Nigeria's national security advisor, the delegation had flown into Washington with the hope of persuading U.S. officials to reconsider the CPC label. But the conversations did not unfold the way the Nigerian officials expected. Multiple lawmakers referenced their discussion with the delegation, expressing surprise not at Nigeria's arguments, but at what was missing. There were no clear numbers about how many people had been killed. No cohesive plan for addressing years of terrorist attacks. No demonstration that the Nigerian government understood the gravity of its own situation. And for a Congress that had listened to grieving pastors, displaced families, and human rights advocates for nearly 2 decades, this lack of clarity spoke volumes. At the center of the debate was a sensitive but unavoidable issue: were Christians being targeted? Some witnesses argued that the killings in Plateau Benue and parts of Kaduna were clearly aimed at Christian communities. Others pointed out that moderate Muslims were also victims punished for refusing extremism or for speaking out. But beneath the arguments lay a deeper truth, one that both American and Nigerian witnesses ultimately agreed on. Nigerians are being killed, period. And the world can no longer afford to look away. The host of Inside Sources, who once served as executive director of the Christian Association of Nigerian Americans, brought a particularly intimate perspective. He recalled sitting with Christian survivors who had lost relatives because they refused to renounce their faith. Their stories were not abstract reports, they were faces, voices, and trembling hands he had personally held. And while he acknowledged that Christians were undeniably targeted in many regions, he also emphasized that many Muslims, especially those who preached peace, had suffered the same fate. In other words, this was not a contest of victimhood, this was a national tragedy. And for the first time in years, an American president had put the full force of the United States government behind addressing it. Trump's CPC designation, though controversial, had opened a door that had long been sealed shut. It created the possibility of direct military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and the deployment of specialized tools, night vision systems, counterterrorism training, and rapid response coordination that could finally disrupt the networks responsible for decades of violence. For Nigerians who have long felt ignored or silenced by their own government, this moment represented something rare, a chance to leverage international support to defeat the merchants of terror, banditry, and violent extremism who have operated with impunity for far too long. But there was another layer to the story, one that would soon come to light when Congressman Chris Smith spoke. Because while the CPC decision offered hope, it also revealed something uncomfortable about the Nigerian government's past actions and its reluctance to fully confront the crisis unfolding on its own soil. And that is where the next chapter of this story begins. The emotional peak of this unfolding story came when Congressman Chris Smith began to speak. For anyone who has followed human rights issues in Washington over the past 4 decades, Smith's voice carries a weight that cannot be ignored. But on this particular day, his tone was different, warmer, heavier, almost trembling, with a kind of moral frustration that only comes from seeing the same wounds left untreated for far too long. He recalled the meeting he had just held with Nigeria's high-level delegation, a meeting he described as civil, but painfully honest. Nigerian officials, he said, entered the discussion believing that the country of particular concern CPC designation was a punishment. They insisted that Christian persecution was exaggerated, that killings were random, and that the Nigerian government was responding appropriately. But, as Smith told them directly and repeated again inside the hearing room, CPC is not a punishment. It is a mirror. Then he shared what that mirror had shown him over the years. He spoke of pastors whose congregations had been slaughtered, of moderate Muslim leaders who told him privately that if they dared condemn extremism publicly, they would be murdered within days. And then he mentioned one of the most heart-shattering testimonies he had ever heard, a woman who lost 5 of her children in a single attack. As he said her name, the room fell silent. Suddenly, this was not a political debate. It was a funeral eulogy happening on Capitol Hill. Smith has chaired more than 700 human rights hearings, yet the anguish in his voice made it clear that Nigeria's crisis is among the most painful he has encountered. What troubled him most was not just the killings themselves, but the absence of action from the Nigerian government. He emphasized that extremist groups like Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa do not number in the millions. Many estimates put their active fighters in the low thousands. When there is genuine will, he said, terrorism can be defeated. But will real, sustained, courageous will is what he believes has been missing. It was here at this emotional crest that he turned directly to what the United States was prepared to do. Trump's CPC designation, he explained, is not the end. It is the official beginning of a 2-step process. Step 1, acknowledge the problem. Step 2, apply the tools needed to force real reform. Those tools include diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions, visa bans for officials complicit in abuses, and perhaps most importantly, military and intelligence partnerships designed to stop terrorist networks before they strike. He noted that America's ambassador to the United Nations himself, a 26-year Green Beret, had once worked directly with Nigerian special forces in rescue operations. The capability is there, Smith insisted. The expertise is there. What is needed now is cooperation and a Nigerian government willing to protect its people. What made this moment even more powerful was his refusal to let anyone soften the truth. When Nigerian officials claimed that Christians were not being killed because they are Christians, he pushed back sharply. The patterns of attack, the slogans shouted during raids, the testimonies from victims, these were not abstract theories. These were facts. But Smith did not call for division. Instead, he called for something almost revolutionary, a unified interfaith summit, Christian and Muslim leaders together, meeting under the same roof, facing the same truth, and demanding the same protection for their communities. Division, he warned, was the enemy's greatest weapon. Unity was Nigeria's only hope, and yet as powerful as his words were, they led to a sobering question that hung heavy in the air. If American lawmakers can see the crisis so clearly, why can't Nigeria's own leaders act with the same urgency? That question and the painful gap between Washington's determination and Abuja's paralysis would shape the next stage of this story, where human fear, government decisions, and the lives of innocent schoolchildren collide in ways no nation should ever accept. Before anyone could fully process what was said in the hearing room in Washington, another scene thousands of miles away in Nigeria began unfolding with an urgency that no congressional report could prepare the world for. Picture it: classrooms that should be filled with morning chatter and the sound of children reciting lessons suddenly emptied in fear. Chairs left askew. Chalk left mid-sentence on the board. Teachers rushing students out of buildings because armed men had once again targeted the youngest and most defenseless members of society. This is what terrorism looks like on an ordinary school day in Nigeria, and this is where the consequences of government inaction become painfully visible. As Dr. David Okoro, a security strategist, explained from the studio in Abuja, every terrorist group understands the psychology of fear. They film beheadings, record kidnappings, and circulate images of victims for one reason: to create the belief that the state cannot protect its citizens. Bandits do it to force ransom payments. Extremists do it to expand their influence. But what happens when a government responds exactly as these groups want? According to Okoro, that is precisely what occurred in recent weeks. In the wake of fresh kidnappings, one attack taking more than 200 schoolchildren in Niger State, the Nigerian government ordered the closure of unity schools and then watched as private schools, state schools, and eventually entire regions followed suit. Instead of projecting strength, the government projected fear. Instead of reassuring parents, it confirmed their worst anxieties. To Dr. Okoro, this was not just a policy error, it was a national capitulation. He argued with striking clarity that closing schools sends a message more destructive than any terrorist bullet: the bandits are bigger than Nigeria itself. For a nation that prides itself on being Africa's most populous democracy, such symbolism is devastating. And for the children whose futures depend on education, the damage is immeasurable. Okoro did not stop there. He pointed to a deeper structural failure: the misuse of security resources. While schools remain vulnerable, more than 120,000 Nigerian police officers are assigned to protect politicians, wealthy entertainers, and private individuals. These officers guard mansions, accompany convoys, escort VIPs around Abuja, and offer their services as personal bodyguards while rural communities and school campuses remain exposed. In a moment of crisis, Okoro insisted a nation must redeploy its resources, not retreat from its responsibilities. Then came the legal context provided by Abuja-based lawyer Ibrahim Wali, revealing why justice against terrorists rarely arrives. According to him, Nigeria has spent the past decade facing terrorist violence without developing a single comprehensive, modern legal framework designed to arrest, prosecute, or convict these groups effectively. Court dockets are overwhelmed. Investigation processes are outdated. Anti-terror laws remain superficial. Even Nigeria's own foreign minister could not provide accurate casualty numbers during a live interview with Piers Morgan. Wali called it what it is: a no-policy policy. A vacuum where leadership should stand, and this vacuum breeds consequences beyond insecurity. It creates a political culture where violent criminals walk free, while outspoken citizens become targets. Both analysts pointed to recent cases in Niger State, where young critics and opposition figures such as Abubakar Issa Makwa and Abdul Malik Nagenu were detained not for violence but for speaking out about flood school conditions or election irregularities. The pattern is unmistakable. When governments fail to confront terrorists, they begin confronting their own citizens instead. And as school gates close, courtrooms stall, and communities grieve without answers, the cost of this failure grows heavier, not just for Nigeria, but for the world watching, wondering how a nation with such promise could fall so far behind the threat it now faces. From the outside looking in, the crisis in Nigeria can seem like a distant conflict, one more headline in a world drowning in headlines. But inside the United States, especially in Washington's foreign policy and human rights circles, Nigeria's instability is viewed not as an isolated tragedy, but as a test of global responsibility. And that perspective shaped every moment of the congressional hearing and every word spoken by the American officials who participated. For U.S. lawmakers like Congressman Chris Smith, the situation in Nigeria is not merely another diplomatic concern, it is a symbol of what happens when a nation's internal failures begin to affect the moral conscience of the world. America, he emphasized, is home to one of the largest Nigerian diasporas on earth. Pastors, nurses, professors, engineers, imams, caregivers, millions of Nigerians live, work, worship, and contribute in all 50 U.S. states. Their voices, their stories, and the suffering of their families back home become part of America's own social fabric. So when violence persists for decades with no accountability, it raises an uncomfortable question in Washington. What does it say about global leadership if one of Africa's most influential nations cannot protect its own people? From America's standpoint, Nigeria is not just any nation. It is a strategic ally with deep economic, cultural, and security ties. It is a bellwether for West Africa. As Nigeria goes, so goes Africa, as Smith recalled being told by a Nigerian bishop. And that is precisely why the United States cannot ignore a crisis that threatens to destabilize not only Nigeria, but the broader region. This perspective also explains why the CPC designation carries such weight internationally. When the United States labels a nation as a country of particular concern, it sends a message far beyond its borders. Other global players, Europe, the African Union, humanitarian agencies, and human rights organizations, take cues from America's assessment. Suddenly, the silence around Nigeria's killings breaks. The world begins paying attention, and the expectation for reform grows. But America's global perspective goes deeper than condemnation. It is grounded in the belief that partnership, when taken seriously, can change outcomes. Smith underlined this repeatedly. The U.S. is prepared to share intelligence, provide specialized training, deploy counterterrorism expertise, and supply tools that could drastically weaken extremist networks. These are not symbolic gestures. They are capabilities forged through decades of hard fight against terrorism across multiple continents. Yet for all this potential, one challenge remains: Nigeria must show the political will to participate in its own rescue. This is where international observers grow uneasy. While Washington is calling for unity, transparency, and decisive action, parts of Nigeria's leadership appear hesitant, defensive, or distracted by internal political battles. The arrests of critics in Niger State, the paralysis in prosecuting terrorists, and the nationwide closure of schools all signal to the world that Nigeria's crisis is not merely a security issue, it is a governance issue. This disconnect raises a final question that echoes through U.S. policy circles and even across Africa itself. Can Nigeria reform quickly enough to make international support effective, or will outside partners be forced to watch from a distance as the crisis deepens? Other African nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, even smaller countries exploring their own sovereignty-driven reforms, are being watched through the same global lens. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are being compared, fairly or not, to Nigeria's leadership in terms of decisiveness, national security, and their ability to protect ordinary citizens. And as the world weighs these comparisons, one conclusion becomes unavoidable: Nigeria's future will influence Africa's future, and the world expects it to rise, not fall. As we step back from the congressional hearing, the testimonies, the grief, the statistics, and the political disagreements, one reality becomes impossible to ignore: a nation that cannot protect its children cannot protect its future. And whether we look at Nigeria from the streets of Abuja or from the halls of Washington, the warning signs are flashing brighter than ever before. School gates are closing, families are fleeing, courts are overwhelmed, entire communities feel forgotten. And as the world watches, the question is no longer whether Nigeria faces a crisis. It is whether Nigeria still has the leadership and the moral courage to confront that crisis before it swallows an entire generation. For older Americans, those who have lived through the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, Iraq, and decades of global conflict, there is a familiar rhythm to moments like this. You know what it means when a nation reaches a crossroads. You know what it means when a government risks losing the trust of its people. And you know what happens when the world looks away. That is why this moment matters. The CPC designation by the United States is not an attack on Nigeria. It is a wake-up call. A signal to Abuja that the world has seen enough bloodshed, enough excuses, and enough indifference to suffering. It is an invitation, perhaps the last one, to work hand in hand with partners who want to see Nigeria rise, not collapse. But this moment also carries a second warning. When a government focuses more energy on silencing critics than stopping terrorists, it is drifting toward a dangerous path, one that history has seen many times and rarely forgiven. And while Nigeria struggles with its internal challenges, other African nations are rewriting their own stories. In Burkina Faso, leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are taking bold, sometimes controversial steps to strengthen national security, rebuild institutions, and restore dignity to communities long ignored by global powers. Whether one agrees with his methods or not, his name now appears frequently in Africa news because he has forced a conversation about sovereignty responsibility and the duty of leaders to protect their people. So the world is asking, and Americans are asking, whether Nigeria will seize its moment or let it slip away. Tonight, I want to leave you with questions that only you, the viewers, can answer. Do you believe Nigeria's leaders are ready to act with the urgency this crisis demands? Should the United States deepen its partnership or demand clearer accountability first? And as Africa enters a new era of self-determination, is Nigeria prepared to lead? Or will others take that place? If you care about truth more than headlines about people, more than politics, and about a safer future for Africa's children, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Your voice matters perhaps more than you realize. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first who truly understand what is happening. And subscribe if you believe that honest reporting is more important than ever.